Well, one tool that I use for more of like the anxiety side of me for like a while and before this was like impulsivity of like, okay, if I just do it, I'm not going to stop obsessing about it as much. And like that was a really freeing thing to do. But also, and I'm still working through this with my therapist of really understanding what vulnerability means to me, because vulnerability looks a lot different from me because I squirt on the stage in front of like hundreds of people. Like everyone's like, wow, that's so vulnerable. And I'm like, that's a Tuesday for me. So it's understanding what vulnerability means for me because I've pushed through so many things that are classically vulnerable. So it's understanding that emotional vulnerability and just being able to sit with it and to try to stop intellectualizing everything, which is easier said than done.
I'm Cindy Darnell. Welcome to The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we examine and explore sex and relationships through social, personal, cultural, scientific, political, and other lenses, and unpack and explore your erotic quandaries with the world's wisest erotic philosopher. Welcome back to Season 4 of The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we explore life, sex, and modern relationships with some of the world's wisest erotic philosophers. My name is Cindy Darnell. I'm a sexologist and sex and relationships therapist and coach, and of course, the host of The Erotic Philosopher. I'm also the author of Sex When You Don't Feel Like It, The Truth About Mismatched Libido and Rediscovering Desire. You can find out more about me at my website, cindydarnell.com. Before we jump into today's interview, I want to tell you about a new project I'm working on, my online subscription community, where you can learn more about the issues that we tackle here on The Erotic Philosopher, be they relational, personal, emotional, sexual, and beyond. So many of us need help and scaffolding to make sense of our complicated lives and relationships these days, so this new online community serves as a portal to learn more from me and from others as we dive into the issues most important to us in creating meaningful lives and fulfilling sex. You'll see more about this on my website, cindydarnell.com, under the Community tab. Now, let me introduce you to today's guest, Lola Jean, sex educator, fetish wrestler, ProDomme, and world record holder for Volume Squirting, providing the No Frills Sex Education we both need and deserve. Lola brings a refreshing understanding to sex, sexuality, and kink to move individuals beyond what they think they are capable of. In this interview, Lola Jean speaks candidly about her journey through emotional development and what she's learnt about power dynamics from her work as a ProDomme and how they inform what happens to us in our relationships. She tells us about her inspiration behind her squirting world record, and we navigate what developing erotic intelligence means for creating meaningful relationships and satisfying sex. Whether you're interested in kink, squirting, emotional development, or more, you'll enjoy this honest and transparent discussion with Lola Jean. Lola Jean, welcome to The Erotic Philosopher. It's nice to see you.
It's nice to see you again.
Seen you since the before time.
I know. I was like, since we were all locked inside and couldn't leave. It's been busy. The pandemic's been tough, but it also has been good to me. It's been like kind of a nice forced creative time.
Oh, I'm looking forward to hearing a lot more about what you've been up to. And I've seen bits and pieces online about what you've been up to. But before we get into any of the fabulousness that you've been embodying, what would you like folks to know about you who might be meeting you for the first time?
I feel like there's two things that might surprise people. One is that I'm like deeply, deeply into American football and also sports gambling. No other sex person is. Not me, no. And the other thing is that up until 3 years ago, I was a relationship virgin. So I had not been in any kind of serious or romantic relationship at all. And that was not necessarily a choice. And kind of coinciding with that too, I went to Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous and really identified with the emotional anorexics a lot. And that was really helpful in my own journey.
Interesting. We can dig into that as we go through our discussion, because I'm curious about what emotional anorexics are, because I haven't heard that expression. So we'll sort of put a pin in that and come back to it. But let's begin with your, one of your current professional incarnations, which is you are, and tell me if I've got this right or wrong, the world record holder for volume squirting. Is that correct?
That is correct. The most amount of volume produced by a person without assistance of any other people or toys within a 1 minute period.
Interesting. That's a very specific category. This is a Guinness World Record, or is this some other kind? Right. Okay.
Because Guinness is a family organization, but I did it by Guinness standards, hence all of the stipulations.
Okay. All right. And so talk us through sort of the origins of this and how it came to be that you got to hold this title.
So I started squirting, or I started becoming aware that I squirted about, I guess, 6 or 7 years ago, which is sort of around the time that I started dabbling in sex education and pro-domination, fetish wrestling, all these things sort of at the same time. And it was during that time that I was also really discovering myself sexually for probably the second time in my life. And through sleeping with lots and lots of people and their responses of people who have also slept with lots and lots of people, I really discovered that wow, I have a significant amount of not only volume, but control. So that's something that I own. And after I started teaching about squirting, a doctor that I worked with, Dr. Jean, she would teach about it and often talk about the max amount a person could squirt was 900 milliliters. And I always kind of joked, I'm like, yeah, but I could probably crush that. And that joke kind of turned into a reality when I started looking into Guinness records to see if one existed, and being able to put that together. So it sort of became a joke to put science to shame, or also to prove that there's a lot more to squirting than we think that there is. Because whenever I heard, that's why I started teaching about squirting, because whenever I would hear educators talking about it, I'm like, I can prove what you're saying wrong in 5 seconds. There's a lot more to this, especially from the squirter's perspective. I have a lot more control over this than people are saying.
Yeah. And so I think, I agree with you that it's a very misunderstood activity, and there's a lot of conjecture about it, which we're not going to go into because it's all over the internet and it's, tedious. So let's not even go there. But your experience I'm especially interested in, because what I do see consistently is the experiences of squirters are often erased or overlooked, or, whatabouteried with various other things that ultimately end up not being helpful, because at the end of the day, it's one's relationship to one's own body that matters most in all things sex and pleasure, including squirting. So when you talk about this idea of control, which I love, and, I imagine, I think that sort of piggybacks into, kink and BDSM as well, this notion of control and power, but we'll save that again, another pin. This control that you have, does it seem to be connected to the fact that you are into fitness, or at one point you were into fitness, and you're an especially physically strong person as well? Do you think there's a correlation there?
I think the correlation is more with the awareness of one's body, and especially when you're doing physical fitness, you should be, or you become a lot more aware of your body, of what's hurting, what do you need to flex, where do you need to make sure your posture is okay so that you don't hurt yourself when you're lifting heavy weights or something like that. Because when I talk about who is able to squirt, it's a lot about having a good relationship and understanding of your vulva. And a lot of times before I'll do a squirting demonstration or performance, what I'm doing is I'm I'm having a mind to vulva connection before I squirt. Like that's the main thing that's needed. So there's a contrary belief that like you have to have a physically fit vagina to do all these things and do all the Kegel weights, et cetera, et cetera. And like a lot of pelvic floor therapists will tell you that's actually really bad. Like you can have a hypertonic pelvic floor. So it's not the strength, it's more the understanding that the strength not of my vagina, but of my body, of that can give me. And then it's just, I mean, after I squirted for the first time, I was like, what is this? And then I like kept masturbating until I understood what it was.
And there it is. And now you teach classes in it, right?
I do. And I take a really hands-off approach to squirting. I'm not the kind of person who's like, you're going to take this class and squirt at the end. That's what's happening. Do it now. Like it's going to happen on your own timeline. I'm just helping you understand the process that your body will be going through so that it's not as foreign to you, and then what you may have to do with that. But I mean, I think it's really dumb to pressure people with vulvas to do anything. So I want absolutely no part in that.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And what kind of people then come to your classes, or what kind of people have an interest in wanting to do this for themselves, especially when it's, when we can sort of separate it from the social pressure of having to perform like a seal in a circus kind of thing. What inspires people to want to have this kind of deeper relationship with this possibility for their body?
Unfortunately, I do get a lot of people that are wanting to do it for a partner, feeling pressured by them. And I hope I do, but I know a lot of the times I also do provide them an outlet where they can either find their own interest or power in it, or sometimes realize that like, wow, I don't want to do this at all. Actually, I don't have any enjoyment about it, or even validating people who are like, I kind of hate this thing, or I don't really like it that much. Like, yeah, absolutely. That's also fine, just because society's obsessed with it. So I get a lot of those. And I think it's other people that I have a little like fake flow chart of like, why are you interested in this? And I always say like, keep revisiting it until you find a reason that's like either my body is capable of doing this thing, so I want to see like what that's about because I want to experience a lot of things, or I'm a lot of like curiosity and searching, but I really want them to get away of other people think it's hot. I want to do this thing because everyone else is doing it. It seems really great, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And being able to find one's own motivation aside from, feeling the social pressure to do it, which I think sort of probably really affects younger vulva owners rather than folks my age who are less interested in filling a social script and more like kind of, I just want to have a good time for myself. Does it tend to be younger folks who will come to these classes?
It tends to be because, I mean, I think there's a wave of like much younger and younger folks being more invested in their sexuality and their sex lives and learning about it instead of just kind of pioneering on their own. So I think that's a trend in itself. But I think for the large part, when I get people that are maybe older or over 40 or something like that, it's people who are like, I didn't invest in this when I'm younger and I want to do it now, or I just discovered something new about my body. I didn't know I could do that at 40 plus. What else do I not know? So it's both of these stages are of discovery, but I find that like the majority tend to be like 20 to 40 probably, but I definitely, especially with my like squirty family and all that, there's definitely 40, 60, 70. And I think that's really awesome because it shows people that you can never stop learning about your body and sexuality.
Right. Absolutely. And that at any age, you'd be astounded at what the body is capable of. So let's shift over now to some other aspects of your knowledge that you bring that I think are really unique in this space around your history as a sex worker, your history as a ProDomme, and what that has taught you about, I guess, not only teaching kink and kink practices to people, but in particular, how kink practices can play out to enhance people's relationships, and the kinds of and the ways that power dynamics in particular tends to inform people's relationships, whether they're aware of them or not. Do you want to speak a little bit about, what insights you've gained from all of those years of experience, and then what you're doing now in terms of public education with that knowledge?
Yeah. So my journey in kink education started with my personal journey in kink. And I feel like this story is a great example for so many things, whether it's like understanding your feelings, of your desired feelings versus desired activities, or also just misconceptions. And when we think of, I feel like when you say like kink to enhance your relationship, people automatically go to like a little bedroom kit of like, oh yeah, let's try bondage and spanking. And I call those the kink starter pack of like a spank, a choke, and a hair pull. And that's what people go to, which can be the most dangerous. And people just do wrong all the time because they're like, I know how to choke someone or pull their hair, when like, there's different ways of doing it. But when I started out in kink, I thought that I was a bratty submissive, which is a joke now. But when I was doing so, I like spanking. Yeah, that feels like an entry level thing. And I thought that I like spanking. It turns out I just like attention and I hate pain. And I can get attention in so many different ways that don't involve getting hit. But that was confusing to me because since spanking was something that was new and interesting, I put up with the pain or the hitting so that I could get the attention.
That is a really profound insight. I think there are a lot of people across the gender spectrum for whom attention is a massive erotic turn on, and it gets circumvented with all this other stuff where they end up agreeing to or participating activities that they're perhaps a bit lukewarm about, when actually what they want to feel is the validation of attention.
Yeah. Or even just like different options of it. Like LT and I teach us a lot in our choking course, where people really think that they like to be choked, but there's many different ways of doing this. And you can still get the sensation of feeling of like someone controlling you without any kind of pressure on your throat too. Or like we call it a fantasy choke, where like the hand is, if you put a hand on your throat, it feels invasive because it's a very delicate part of your body. So there's no need to like squeeze or push or any of that to get this same sensation that most people desire from that. And I think it's both the misdirection maybe of like attention or one of the other motivations, but also it's like this novelty can really get in the way. So you try something salacious for the first time, you're like, well, I had fun, I must like that. And then you do it 5 more times, you're like, are you still trying to chase that, like whatever the phrase is, like the white rabbit or whatever it is? Or like, do you actually like this thing? Are you trying to chase the high from the first time that actually was just trying something new?
Yeah. And I guess that's where the real difference between imagining a scenario in your mind and then actually finding the confidence or the wherewithal to actually go, no, I want to try this, I want to do this. And then with something like you're saying with choking in particular, which can go dangerously wrong, horribly wrong, teaching people to be able to identify so much more than just, replicating what they see in dodgy porn, that they actually look at it through a much deeper lens than just fulfilling a script, especially if their motivation is to get attention and maybe even validation.
And I think that's what really drew me to teaching, and why I think that I'm such a good teacher, or like my approach to it is particular, is because I'm not just teaching you how to do a thing. We're going to get there as well, but it's also like all of these notions that you need to think about going into it to like prevent yourself from getting hurt or other people from getting hurt, instead of, oh, spanking, that's hot, show me how to do it, show me how to hit the butt. It's like, okay, but let's understand all of these other things going into it, because if you want to be spanked because you're naughty, that's going to be different than wanting to be spanked because you want attention, or because you want to be degraded, or you want to be adored. Like there's so many different ways of doing so. So it's really, I call it like the sneaky chef approach, where there was like some mom who was like, here's how I put all these vegetables in my kids' food. And they think it's super tasty because there's cheese in it or chocolate or whatever. And it's like, I'm sneaky chefing your sex education. Like, you want to learn how to squirt and you're going to end up learning about bodily autonomy.
Right. Which I think it's fantastic. And what better way to learn it than in context? You know, when it's in context, it makes it so much more meaningful. I hope you're enjoying this episode of The Erotic Philosopher as much as I enjoy bringing it to you. I love being able to introduce these guests from around the world to you, and in return, it would help me enormously if you would go to Apple or wherever you listen to podcasts and leave The Erotic Philosopher a rating and review. Your labor there helps this podcast land in front of people's eyes and ears, and what better way to help create a more inclusive and supportive world than spreading more information to more people? And you'd be doing a great favor to me too. If you would like to find out more about working with me, head over to my website, that's cindydarnell.com, where you'll see my offerings as a therapist or coach for a streamlined and personalized service, plus my online pleasure school under the online courses tab, where you'll find a suite of pre-recorded classes ready to go. There's something there for everyone. You'll also find my online community under the community tab, where you can join me and others just like you navigate the topics we discuss here on The Erotic Philosopher and so much more. There's no shame in needing support to better understand these complex parts of our lives, and I am here to support you every step of the way. We're also on Instagram and Twitter at The Erotic Philos, that's PHILOS. You can also follow me on social media. I am at Cindy, CYNDI_DARNELL on Instagram, TikTok, and on Twitter. Thanks for joining us here today, and now let's get back to the episode. What have you learned over the years about the nature of power dynamics in relationships, whether they're kinky relationships and, you know, truly even vanilla relationships have power dynamics? Any people in relationships who pretend that there's no power dynamic, that it's totally 100% neutral, I'm just like, no, I don't. It's not. Like, how can it be? And, you know, in the kink world, the BDSM world, and then particularly in sex work world, that dynamic is incredibly explicit, which makes it transactional on one hand, but also makes it much easier to navigate because everybody knows their role. Whereas when you start mixing in feelings, maybe even love, maybe even affection, all that stuff gets blurred, and people, you know, what I see in my work is that people end up saying yes to things that they mean to say maybe to, or they say no to things that they actually want to say yes to because they're too scared to say yes. Because if they say yes, then it's going to mean, you know, if I give you an inch, you're going to take a mile, and then, you know, I'm going to get pissed off. So power dynamics, relationships, let's go there.
Well, for the last thing you were saying, it just made me think of within relationships, because there's all these other dynamics and feelings and like sometimes history that's wrapped up in this. Shayla and I, who's the other headmistress of 7 Days of Domination, which is a marathon online BDSM education series, we often recommend for couples or people that just have a long-standing dynamic that when they're starting to engage in kink or BDSM, that they do so without these additional power dynamics. So there's something within like pro-domination. We say that a lot of newbies often confuse a fetishist with a submissive. So
Can you explain the difference for people who might not know?
Yeah. So a submissive, whether it's in, you know, a pro session or not, this is someone where there is an added power dynamic within all of the kink. And I feel like it's kind of easier to explain a fetishist to understand this. A fetishist is someone who enjoys the activity for the sake of it, and you can engage in all of these different things without having an added power dynamic. So the way that we describe this in, say, a professional setting where the only power dynamic there is provider and client. So it's kind of like if you're going to get a massage and your masseuse is telling you like, okay, like roll over, do that. Like, you're going to listen to them and do what they're saying. But if they're just like, roll over, you little bitch, you're like, wait, what? This is horrible customer service. So it's like, you know, you can still, like, someone can still instruct you and lead you and guide you. It's kind of like more about a top and bottom dynamic as opposed to dominant and submissive. But there isn't like that inherent, like the added power dynamic from just top and bottom. And because that can get really murky with added emotions and feelings and all of that. And I prefer the fetishist dynamic because there's enough things to get you excited about all of that, like outside of the dominant and submissive. And I think it can make people really more comfortable because there's a lot more autonomy that each person has inherently. You can always build that autonomy, but it's harder if you're new to this.
With the fetishist dynamic rather than the submissive dynamic. Right.
Yeah.
Because in the submissive element, the dominant submissive element, am I right in understanding or interpreting that there's a degree of vulnerability that has to come along with those roles? Whereas in a fetishism context, where it's really about the activities, not about the feeling so much, there's less vulnerability involved. There's less, the stakes are a bit lower, perhaps?
I wouldn't say less vulnerability or feelings, because there still are like desired feelings that you can help people achieve. So the way that I describe dominance and submission is, with dominance, it is the ability to guide someone into a safe, non-physical space where they can be at their most vulnerable. And I'm sure, as you know, as like an intimacy expert, vulnerability can be described as so many different things. So with a fetishist, they could be very physically vulnerable, and the physical vulnerability could lead to more emotional vulnerability. And like, there's still, like you were saying, there's power dynamics everywhere. And there's still this power dynamic of top and bottom and the responsibility of top versus bottom. But that is much less than of dominant and submissive. And I just think of this experience I had when I was, trying out my submissive side of someone who was dominating me and just didn't really understand my needs or wants, and like choked me and told me they wanted to see me cry. And I was like, that's horrible. I don't want to cry. And I think it's a lot of these assumed dynamics of, I have the power. I have to have the power. So I need to make you more vulnerable or make you more weak or whatever that may be. And when you're trying, and especially if you're new to this, like, there's so many things that you just don't necessarily understand. So it could just make things very, very complicated, especially if the person in the top of the power dynamic is feeling like they need to compensate in some way of like, I'm not feeling as in control because I've been dating you for 10 years and I'd never say something like this. So I need to really assert it.
Right. And that sometimes folks will then default to cruelty or meanness or sadism or whatever, which, can be a part of a dynamic in all kinds of contexts, but that you're making the distinction that domination and dominating does not have to be connected to sadism and cruelty. It can also be a loving act. You can actually dominate someone, with a heart full of love. And perhaps that this is in a BDSM context in particular. I think people often misunderstand that dominance and sadism are not necessarily the same thing, although they can be. And then in more vanilla contexts where there are still dominant roles, because that's not to say that vanilla relationships don't have power dynamics. They absolutely do. They're just not as explicit, which in my observation, working with couples can often make them much more, I think dangerous is not the word, but often make them much more treacherous, because it's sort of, a bit of a kind of smell the fart moment. Everybody can smell this thing. It's there, but nobody wants to own up to it. And because we can't talk about it, because no one's going to say, all right, this is actually happening, it's much harder to deal with when we can't give it a name. Whereas in couples who are explicitly kinky or explicitly into BDSM, it's a much easier thing to acknowledge because it's already out front and it's not seen as something to hide and be ashamed of.
Yeah. And it makes me think a lot of consent too, because like what you were saying, where couples in long-standing relationships, a lot of times they'll say no and they mean yes, or etc. For people that are like really getting into like consent after Me Too, and they're just like, I just want the yes, so I feel good about myself, and it's not actually about, bodily autonomy and communication. They might be like, oh, well, my person said they wanted me to call them filthy names and use sadism, et cetera, but they just might be being a pick-me. I definitely did that for a while too. So like, that's another, like, how do you know that you can trust that the first time round, which again is why I'm like, just do it without the added power dynamic too. And you were speaking to like, in vanilla relationships, dominant, submissive. And I feel personally, I think calling it a dominant or submissive role outside of the BDSM context is doing a disservice, because it still feels wrapped up in toxic masculinity. And I think it's just more identifying as a power dynamic where there is certain inherent like power in certain kind of situations, whether that's in a working dynamic, whether that's just with the privileges that one affords from being white or cis or male or whatever, or able-bodied, like all of these different things. And I hear it all the time with couples where, like, I think you were saying this too, people be like, oh, we're equals here. If I tell you there's no power dynamic, that means there's none. And that's not how acknowledging a power dynamic works. So let's say even that there's a really big age difference, and that's an inherent power dynamic. That's something that the person who is on like the older side and has that inherent power needs to not only acknowledge, but kind of afford these different concessions. So that means not just saying like, well, I'm older than you, so let's make sure that you're on board, because that person might still be like, well, yeah, I'm on board because I don't know any better and I'm just going to follow you. And I don't know what's going to happen if I say no. Like, you need to have instances where the person with the lesser power dynamic can exercise their no without consequence. So without someone getting pouty or angry or all of these things. And also whoever has more power in the dynamic has to exercise patience, a lot of patience, and not needing anything to happen right now. And that can kind of assure you that, oh, this person is just saying this to please me, or because they're not sure. And that feels like a safer default answer. Like, you can never be sure of all of these things. So why not just wait and make sure that person is okay with that decision? Because it's a lot of this fear of consequence, or think like, I feel bad that I don't know how I want to feel or how I am feeling, so I'm just going to lie because that feels easier.
Yeah. And I think that this is a really important thing for us to dig into now at this point. Is one of the key skills that is often overlooked in sex education at an adult level, not like in schools, but actually probably even in schools too, is the emotional component, being able to learn to identify one's own feelings. And, you were saying before we started the recording, how this is something that has really, come true for you in the last few years, about recognizing the power of emotional intelligence as a tool for creating a powerful sex life. So talk more about your experience of that and how that was for you.
Yeah. So within BDSM, we often like to advise to lead with feelings as opposed to activities, because those feelings can not only inform how those activities take place, they can also inform what kind of activities that you may want to do. And so what this means is, and we created like kind of similar, it was inspired by like autistic feelings charts of like the little faces and picking the feeling. We made that for kink feelings, no matter if you're a dominant or submissive. So it's easier, instead of saying, I want to feel horny or aroused, like that tells us absolutely nothing. So those things of saying, I want to feel small versus I want to feel degraded, that's going to change how I tie you up, how I spank you, how I wrestle you, like all of these different things, if I know how you want to feel at the end. At the same time, if let's say I really want to be spanked to feel small, and my partner is like, I don't want to hit you, that makes me so uncomfortable, or I have, past experience with abuse, and like that's something that they don't want to do. Instead of being like, well, I don't want to do this, why don't you want to do it if you love me? We can find, well, I want to feel small from this activity, what's another activity I can feel small from that you're either okay with doing or that you enjoy doing? So it can be a great way to find a middle ground instead of this whole, well, I want to do this thing. You got to get on board.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And like to that point, you're not going to know these things off the bat. So a lot of it is, instead of feeling this pressure to, this is what I want, here's my boundaries, all these things I'm supposed to inherently know, you have to really take this time to check in with yourself at every single moment of, am I okay with this? How am I feeling? Is that something I want to feel? Like, what is the sensation? Am I enjoying it for the novelty? Like, you really have to pick these apart both during and after. And that's something that we don't always have this like luxury of really being forced to be able to do, which is, I think, what for me, it was like BDSM professionally. I became a lot more aware of my feelings and what I was okay with, and that I could exercise, I don't like this, and it wasn't a big deal, and it just informs. So it's a lot of this.
For when you were in a pro-dom role or in a pro-submissive role?
In a pro-dom role. I think everyone who's a pro-dom admires pro-submissives, because we're like, I don't know how you do it. And it's a lot of smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, I would find that very challenging.
I'll connect you with some of them. They're truly the heroes.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was in pro-domination, it kind of like takes this whole, it pulls the veil off that you're not just like, do this, do that. Like, the power is just in that I can decide things on a whim, I can direct, but you also have to decide of, if something happens, am I okay with this? Like, oh, this person's doing this now, how do I feel about it? And you have to understand and register it in that situation, or afterwards kind of unpack those things. And as someone who is very emotionally avoidant, it really forced me to be a lot more present in my mind and body.
Mm-hmm. And so I think that's also an interesting thing too, that even when you're in a dominant role, that you're still going to have feelings, and you're still going to get confronted by your own self. You know, that if you are in the middle of play or in the middle of sex and you start feeling a feeling, whatever the feeling is, and you're very committed to being dominant in whatever that looks like for you in that moment, and then you've got this feeling hanging around, I think for a lot of people the tendency would be to just sort of push past it or override it and get to the end of sex or get to the end of the scene and then sort of unpack it, which, you know, is fine. That's an option. Absolutely. And then another option would be to be able to be with the feeling in the moment and be able to change course. But that's a very advanced kind of practice to be able to do that.
And I would say too, like, an acceptable answer is like, I don't know. I use that all the time of like, my partner will be having sex and I'll be like, well, what do you want? I'm like, I don't know. I'm not sure. Like, my body's not telling me anything specifically. Or if something comes up, like, I don't know. It's a totally great and fine answer too.
And it sounds like, even I hear this from the language that you use, that your emotional intelligence radar is not just an intellectual thing, that for you, it sounds like it's very visceral, it's very somatic when you say, my body is not telling me anything, that it sounds like you have a pretty strong communication pathway with your body as the source of some of your feelings.
Actually, not at all. I'm trying to work on that so much.
Okay.
So like, it's very mechanical. So I can have this relationship of like, what is my vulva telling me? What's the health problem? Like, all of that. But in terms of like, what feelings that I have trouble feeling things in my body. I'm like incredibly intellectual. So that's often why a lot of my answer is, I don't know. So most of the time it would be like, how does this feel? Am I okay with this? And I can answer that. But if you're trying to ask me like, how is my body feeling? Or when people say like, where are you feeling this feeling in your body? I'm always like, my chest, but I feel everything in my chest because I have anxiety. So that's just sort of where it goes. But I don't feel colors. I'm not like, oh, I feel it in my heart or my stomach. It's like, I really struggle with that. And a lot of it has to do with the like dismissive avoidance, the like emotional avoidance, and all of that is a lot of a disconnect with kind of like not mind body, but emotions and body. And it's also one of the things that like makes sex work something that really works for me, because I call it like a light dissociation. If I was an empath, this would all be a lot harder.
Okay. All right. And I mean, there's an element of that too. I think that being able to deliberately step outside of one's emotional body, to be able to get things done, which I think a lot of us do just on a daily level anyway. I know when I'm out walking my dog and just navigating the streets around where I live, which at times are pretty sketchy, I have to just sort of check out a little bit because it's too intense out there. It's just too much, you know. So to say that, you know, we need to be 100% embodied and in our bodies, feeling all our feelings 100% of the time is horse shit. Like that's, we wouldn't get anything done if we were all just feeling everything all the time. So it has to be I go for embodiment on demand rather than embodiment at all costs.
I like that.
So with this, you know, and I really appreciate how candid you are about, you know, the gap, I guess, that you can experience between your somatic capacity and your emotional capacity. And then what you were saying at the start of our conversation about this emotional anorexia, which is a phrase I've not heard before. So are these things connected? Talk to me about this emotional anorexia. What does it mean? I don't know what it means.
Yeah, I mean, I was new to it when I was introduced to it. I think it was like it had been, I guess, lightly suggested, but I feel like with any kind of 12-step program, when someone's like, you should go to AA, you're like, fuck you. And then on your own terms, you're like, maybe I should go to AA. So I was good. There's when in Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, or SLAW, as they call it for short, there's so many different like subsects of it. And I was starting to go to meetings and I was just like, well, I don't feel like I'm on the sex addict side of it. And like a lot of these I didn't identify with. And then I went to the avoidance meeting. And as someone who already is like identifies as dismissive avoidant when it comes to attachment style, once I found that, I was like, these are my people. I understand what they're saying. They understand what I'm saying. And then within that, there's even more like minutia detail. And with the emotional anorexics, it can manifest in a lot of different ways, but essentially it's someone who is purposely or not purposely like abstaining from emotional connections. And a lot of it may be due to trauma, to protect self-preservation, protection, and all of these different things. And it was something that took a bit of time because it's not like I was purposely abstaining from romantic relationships, but that was also my reality. I wanted to be in romantic relationships, but I was not in them. And it took a lot of, I was really lucky to find a sponsor who was also a sex worker, because I'm like, I hope someone understands this. I'm not going to stop doing my job to work on these things. And it took a lot of understanding, instead of why do all these people I want to be with not want to be with me, and like really honing in on the important qualities and stop trying to, be a pick me or try to make every person that I'm interested in be in a relationship with me. If it's like, well, they don't have these two qualities that are really important to me. So even though I like the other ones, et cetera, et cetera. And it was really kind of changing that frame of reference a bit and having a big slice of humble pie. But I'm very much an avoidant. It's things that I work through regularly because that's part of my attachment style. And I think I kind of felt like Cinderella with like the witch's spell or Snow White or something like that, where I'm like, I just need this first relationship to unlock the spell, and then I'll be able to stop freaking out about it as much and like enjoy these things. And like, fast forward, I've like moved in with my partner now. It's not my first relationship. It might just be like the only one.
And so now that you've sort of been able to address some of the complicated emotional dynamics around, wanting to avoid intimacy or wanting to avoid connection, what are some of the tools that you use to help when the feeling comes up? Because, it's our imprints from when we're young, whether we call them attachment or whatever we call them, they're there. Emotional development attachments or emotional development awareness things. What are some of the tools that you use now when the little gremlins come up to rear their head? How do you manage them these days?
Well, one tool that I use for more of like the anxiety side of me for like a while and before this was like impulsivity of like, okay, if I just do it, I'm not going to stop obsessing about it as much. And like that was a really freeing thing to do. But also, and I'm still working through this with my therapist, of really understanding what vulnerability means to me, because vulnerability looks a lot different from me because I squirt on the stage in front of like hundreds of people. Like everyone's like, wow, that's so vulnerable. And I'm like, that's a Tuesday for me. So it's understanding what vulnerability means for me because I pushed through so many things that are classically vulnerable. So it's understanding that emotional vulnerability and just being able to sit with it and to try to stop intellectualizing everything, which is easier said than done.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's wonderful that you've gone on this journey and whichever tools you've discovered along the way that work for you, that's, great. And that you've found a therapist and a community of folks to support you is just awesome. And I love hearing how things have progressed for you since the last time I saw you. So as we sort of start heading to the end of our conversation today, what do you have coming up? How can folks reach out to you and participate in some of your classes, whether they're here in New York or maybe if they're in some other part of the world? How can they access your infinite wisdom?
Yeah. So I now pretty much almost exclusively do most of my teaching and courses online, just because it's more accessible. You can watch it at any point. You can watch it over again. I have students who watch it with every new partner that they have, which is one of the most adorable things I can think of. So everything's at courses.LolaJean.com, or LolaJean.com will take you there as well. And that's where I have recordings from both Zoom classes as well as some like high production value kind of Netflix style episodic classes as well. And that's called the Quick and Dirty series. And you can find just a myriad of classes on there. I believe there's like over 40 or so. And then in addition to that, there's something called 7 Days of Domination, which was a happy accident from the pandemic. But now it's like a full blown BDSM education school with over 50 teachers, over 70 now different topics. That's 7daysofdomination.com. And in December 3rd, we're launching an online version of our Baby Dom Bootcamp, which is essentially anyone who's interested in a pro-domination career. It's all of the things that you would need in resources to really start this. It's all the unsexy soft skills. It's not how to throw a whip, how to tie someone up. You can find that from one of our 70 classes. It's how to make an ad, what happens if your client has a medical emergency, how to build community, how to vet, like all of the things that are necessary to really starting your business. And then, you can figure out what skills that you want to inhabit from there.
Fantastic. It's so lovely to catch up with you, Lola Jean. Your links to your website are going to be in the show notes for folks who want to have a link to that. Otherwise, Lola Jean's very easy to find on the interwebs by her name and a fabulous presence. Gorgeous to catch up with you, my love.
You too.